the EscapeGoat podcast. A podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Blake Fagiani, and several different guests. Hello and welcome to the EscapeGoat podcast, episode 10. I actually kind of can't believe I've got to episode 10.
Episode 10!
I know.
Exciting.
How crazy is that? It's been, I think, almost 3.5 months since I recorded episode 1 up in Manchester with my brother during the very, very start of the coronavirus lockdown in Britain. So that was lots happened since then. It's been a very, very packed 3.5 months.
Yeah. God.
Yeah, but it does feel it kind of like when I think when I was planning this out, and to the extent that any of it was planned out, and I was thinking about the ambitions for it, getting to double-digit figures of podcasts existing seemed like a very big emotional and mental hurdle. Like it seemed like a great target. It just would all feel a bit more official and kind of realised then, and that's partly why I had such a massive sprint in the early weeks. Not only was I unexpectedly socially unbusy, but I also just was doing like one a week, until I got to 6, because I was like, come on, the quicker you get to 10, then it's like you've arrived, in a very, very small, modest sense of arrived, But I'm really glad you could join me for this one.
Well, thank you so much for having me back, and for having me back for your first double-digit episode.
My absolute pleasure. No, I'm really glad you could join me, and I'm really glad I've got this opportunity to catch up with you again. And this once again is I'm in London, and Kat's beaming in from LA. So it's the early evening for me, and it's the morning for you there, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's almost noon. Almost noon here.
Yeah. Great. How's the weather?
Actually, we're experiencing a little bit of June gloom at the moment. I walked to breakfast, and it was drizzly. Which is this weird thing that happens in June. Usually by the afternoon, it's actually quite warm. By the end of the afternoon yesterday, it was like 95 degrees, which is, in Celsius, very warm. I think it's the number, very warm.
Yeah, it's that, something like that, isn't it? I've never understood Fahrenheit. I've never ever grasped that at all. I wanted to talk to you a little bit, Kat. Catch up with you actually, because when we talked together on episode 5, which was recorded I had to look this up because it's all blurred together so much, but we recorded that in mid-April, so it's now late June really. So that was 2.5 months ago. We were talking it's really elapsed, hasn't it? But we talked a little bit about how stuff was going for you on a sort of professional level, because you people who've listened to episode 5 know you work in the TV industry in editing. So I just wanted to see how those 2.5 months have been since then, and how it's been going, and how the work's been. Yeah,
when we last spoke, I hadn't been working for a while.
Yeah.
But now I think it was only March and April of this year that I didn't have work. So you caught me towards the end of the time when I was very, very bored.
Yeah, that came across.
Yeah, so I was offered some work starting in May for a very short. It was like a 2-week project to create some interstitials, which are basically very short segments for promotion with Cesar Millan, Dog Whisperer, for Nat Geo. And that was the first time I ever worked on something where they were starting to take COVID issues into account and work around them. So I was prepping drives for editors to work on remotely. And the most fascinating thing about that project is that they only would allow one person to be in the house with Cesar Millan. And the idea was this was at-home dog tips, so it's stuff to do with your dogs at home. But they didn't want it to be... They wanted to give it some longevity, so they didn't want to specifically talk about it having anything to do with coronavirus. It's just like, if you just happen to be at home and aren't going anywhere, here's some things you can do with your dog.
Obviously, it's a standard day in 2028, and you're just at home for no reason. Hey, having a great time. Durable.
But they had only one camera, and they were shooting in 4K so that they could kind of punch in and be able to cheat some different angles to make it seem like they had more cameras potentially. And then
Okay.
they had the directors and producers on Zoom. So they were watching the filming and then giving direction over Zoom, which I found very interesting.
Mm.
And I could always, if I was curious about whether I was going to get some camera cards soon or something, that I could pop on the Zoom and see what was going on.
Mm-hmm. So was
And then,
what would you say the talent was Cesar Millan? Was he recording in complete isolation then, apart from the dogs, or was that?
yeah, it was just him and one camera person, and I guess the camera person was his guy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
Is he
then
based on the West Coast as well, or is that?
yeah, he's in Los Angeles, so he's
Mm-hmm. I'll cut that bit.
sure, yeah.
These are the directions to his house and a list of his fears. Not dogs, presumably.
There was one of the interstitials that I found very funny because the fact that it was about the best way to walk your dog. I'm like, if you've got a dog and you haven't figured out how to walk it yet, you've got some bigger problems than staying at home.
Are you sure you have a dog?
but-
You'd be like, are you sure it's not a statue?
But when they were filming this like the bit where he's actually walking the dog, it's down the middle of the road, which the road was empty because of COVID. But I was also thinking, are we really advertising that the best way to walk your dog is down the center of the street and not on the pavement?
Isn't that I Am Legend? I mean, to be fair, I Am Legend probably has more to teach us about this situation than most media, but yeah. So you went into doing that. Was that the very end of April, very beginning of May?
Very beginning of May, and then it went a couple of days into the third week as we were wrapping some stuff up. And then I got a call from an editor I'd worked with previously who asked me if I was available. And I was like, well, tomorrow's my last day on this other thing. So yeah. So I worked Monday through Wednesday finishing up on that Little Caesar Milan thing. And then on the Thursday started on the Titan games with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson.
Wow.
Who... It's like this NBC show that's made by the same people who do American Ninja Warrior,
Mm-hmm.
and then but this is kind of I guess it was The Rock's idea, and it's based off of the American Gladiators, which was a show that I loved as a kid, and that was wild. Just really busy show because we had 20 editors. Plus a ton of producers and a ton of assistant editors, and everyone was working remotely. But essentially, there's an office somewhere that has a bunch of computers that we all have remote access to. So if you went into that office, you'd see it would look like a bunch of ghosts are working on all the computers. But like you open it up like a web browser on your own computer at home and work in there. And the thing there's a little bit of lag sometimes, and sometimes the shift key will get stuck. So you'll, be in the flow of working, and suddenly you're trying to do things and stuff's happening that you wouldn't expect.
Yeah.
And that's the most frustrating part of that experience.
Yeah.
And then there's like daily Zoom meetings. Like we had 40 people in a Zoom meeting.
That's too much for a Zoom meeting.
It's too much. Yeah.
As we've all learned over the past few months.
Zoom exhaustion is a real thing.
I didn't used to have ideas about Zoom aesthetics, and video conferences aesthetics or functionality, but now we all have. I think the classic is like I was calling it the Let It Be model the other day after the Beatles album cover, but when you've got 4 people, or it's like a Mario Kart 4-player. That's the perfect max, I think.
I mean, I used to think I always wanted to see what it would be like if all of my colleagues and I were the Brady Bunch, but it turns out that it's not really what I wanted.
Yeah, it's not as fun. Or Celebrity Squares. I was rewatching some Star Trek Voyager for that second episode with Isabel, and The Rock, it's famous in Star Trek circles, but The Rock was on an episode of Voyager in season 6, so it would have been like maybe year 2000, something like that, and it was one of his first acting roles, really. I think it was like because it was pre-Scorpion King, stuff like that.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's like an episode where 7 of 9 has to, fight an alien gladiatorial arena. It's one of those cheesy setups. But so he basically comes in, does the eyebrow thing. Like you're wearing a stupid alien loincloth. It's very wry, good Dwayne Johnson stuff.
I'm not sure if I mentioned, but on the show he goes by DJ. and then Dwayne Johnson. It's like this rebranding. But they initially, when I was working on it, they were like, "Oh, the DJ ADR came in," and I was like, "Who's DJ?" And they were like, "The star of the show," and I was like, "What?" He's gone by many names in my house, but it has never been DJ.
He's quite cool. He's a ridiculous celebrity, isn't he? Because like he's kind of cool, but like in a really dorky way. Like he's kind of
for sure
ridiculously cheesy.
He's such a dad.
Yeah, he's totally a dad, isn't he? He's like the centrist dad of like the contemporary America. I'm just gonna.
We had a trans athlete, which I thought was pretty cool.
Oh, cool. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see if that gets a lot of coverage.
Yeah, I mean, the social media sort of response was really good, and the trans athlete themselves said it was really emotional for them to watch, but they thought that it was handled really well, and NBC was super proud of it. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's lovely. Yeah, but I'll keep an eye on that one.
But the show that I had pushed that was supposed to start in March is now going to be, well, it was supposed to start on the 6th of July, so I was going to be leaving the Titan Games early. Well, I'm still leaving the Titan Games early, and I'm currently handing over to a friend of mine to take it over. Mm-hmm. But because of the COVID spikes more recently, they've actually pushed it another 2 weeks. So I don't know if that's going to keep happening, but I went on a quick Zoom meeting about that as well, and they told me they're curious about using the GoPro 360. Have you heard of the GoPro 360 at all?
I mean, I'm going to sound like a high court judge now. I believe that's a camera.
You, sir, are not wrong. I've never even met a little camera.
See, still got it. No, do tell me. Do tell me. I do like to learn about these things.
Sure. Essentially, GoPro made a camera a few years ago that could record VR. Can record virtual reality stuff. What? Yeah. So.
What are you talking about? I don't even know. I'm actually sorry I asked now.
It's got a 180-degree lens on the front and back, and records both at the same time. And you can bring the footage in and be able to select a bunch of different angles in 360 degrees. So I think that
of reality. Of reality.
Yes, it is of reality. It's actual reality.
Okay, good. With you so far.
It's more like digital reality.
Oh no, it's gone again.
But they're planning on using this for cows. For filming cows, and I think this is how they're planning on trying to use fewer cameras, is by getting 360 degrees of cow footage. and so
that's a great title for a rom-com.
I don't know how this show is going to work, but currently it looks like I'm going to have 2 weeks off. Between finishing up on Titan Games and then starting work on this other one. And we're talking about some remote workflows for that show as well. It might be one where I'm still going to be going into the office, but everybody else is going to be working remotely, something like that. Mm-hmm. But I was told apparently there's a new sort of position that you can get working in TV and in movies, where you're literally the COVID coordinator.
Right.
Which is kind of like, health and safety, but specifically related to COVID stuff and managing that.
Oh, interesting. So it's almost like that, it was all the rage, wasn't it, a few years ago, to get like intimacy coordinators on set and stuff for sex scenes. So
yes.
There's now like COVID coordinators to just coordinate safety, like for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how it's going to work with things like craft services, where it's essentially a buffet, which isn't okay anymore. So I don't know what it's going to be like, on set for people. But it's like, I was at a friend's and we were watching, I guess they had the UFC sort of fight on, and I don't really watch fights normally, but it was very eerie to have these fighters in the ring, and usually it's like all this high energy because there's this whole crowd and everything, and it's just empty. Very weird.
It makes you realise how much sport of all sorts depends on some sort of crowd reaction or mood, doesn't it? Even the quiet ones like cricket and golf, because the UK football soccer Premier League just started again the other day, and this was like a huge controversy. As it has been, I'm sure, with a lot of American sports. It's the FIFA were involved and the government were involved, and it was all because basically what's happened with the Premier League is Liverpool have just won it. Like just a few days ago, they became the champions, but they haven't won that. Well, they've never won the Premier League in its current form, but they've not won like the top flight of English football for about 30 years since 1990. So that they were ahead. They were crazily ahead. They were clearly going to win it, but then the entire Premiership got cancelled. So I think if we hadn't found a way to restart the Premier League, Liverpool would literally have gone to war with us. It would have been like it would have actually been a civil war. But they have started up again. But in terms of broadcast, what they were doing, because obviously they're playing to empty stadiums, and it's amazing they even got the players back, with the unions involved and everything. It's dodgily advised maybe, but what they did is that in terms of the broadcasters, in terms of crowd noise, they either went with the eerie silence or they went with fake crowd noise, like so the equivalent of canned laughter, but for crowds.
Oh, weird!
And it was really weird because it was a basic ebb of crowd noise. So just the normal game would be happening, the commentators are on, obviously, so it sounds a bit like a football game. But then they're almost mixing it. So like when someone starts to go on a run up to the goal, they start fading in like more excited crowd noise. But there's always a lag because they're reacting to live events. So it's kind of out of sync. It's not the way a normal crowd would react.
Do you suppose that they were playing that for the players?
I don't know.
Was that in the stadium?
That would be even weirder, though. That would be really weird. If you're just in an empty stadium and just around you like, just like this crowd of phantoms. Yeah,
crowd of phantoms. That's definitely chapter 19 of my autobiography.
Yeah, probably this chapter, to be honest.
Yeah, it is this chapter, Crowd of Phantoms. Wow, but I love it.
I like that, or a band name. But yeah, I think it was for the audience benefit at home, but it was eerie, and obviously you can't really replicate that. And I'm sure the UFC stuff was like that,
Yeah, it was a lot like that. Although they weren't trying to put in sound effects, which is very un-American. We love sound effects.
Air horns.
It's shocking when you actually look at a timeline of a show and you see some of the stacks of sound effects that are used for moments, and you watch it and you're like, oh yeah, I can see what that sounds familiar. That this makes sense. But when you actually watch the footage without it, you're like, oh, none of those sounds happen. Why do we accept this? I don't understand. Yeah, apparently American Ninja Warrior is supposed to start in August. They're supposed to be filming. And currently I know that they're having discussions about how to do it, which I'm not a part of. I just happen to be working with the same people who are going to be working on it later on. So I know that they're having technical conversations about how to make it work, but it'll probably also empty crowds.
Is Ninja Warrior a show you've worked on in previous years?
No, I haven't worked on it before.
Is it normally? I get mixed up with these shows. Is that one of the ones that's normally filmed outdoors, or is it normally a studio-based thing?
It is. I think an outdoor kind of studio-esque situation. It's a little bit of both because it's obviously like a setup. They set up all these apparatus, very large jungle gym, intense jungle gyms, and or what do you guys call them? Climbing frames.
Yeah, that's a classic bit of British parlance. Yes.
Okay.
Well done.
But it's like an obstacle course / large climbing frame for very intense people.
Yeah.
And it's funny. I was talking to a friend of mine about it, and they were saying that it was originally a Japanese show, and in the Japanese show they're kind of like, this guy's a truck driver. He's going to try this thing. Oh, he failed. Or, sometimes they get further through it. But with the American versions, they always have these background packages, and it's always like, she's motivated because her mother died of cancer and her sister died in a car crash, and that you end up like really, really rooting and feeling attached to these people.
I suppose it's sort of American. I don't know what shows did that first, but I suppose it's the sort of American Idol thing, isn't it? The sort of like potted backstory, the tear-jerking backstory.
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds great. One thing I wanted to ask you about is from your own experiences, but also in conversations you've had, but maybe from hearsay you've got from other colleagues and stuff as well. When we talked back in April, we were both speculating a little bit about what the resumption of kind of something close to normal business would be in terms of US TV, and what I mean by that is the kind of resumption of what you might call the traditional full schedule, where that's still relevant to network TV. And we talked a little bit about not, you know, obviously reality TV is your usual bread and butter, but we talked a little bit about sort of scripted stuff, you know, and kind of how you know, already scheduled dramas and sitcoms will cope, if at all. Have you heard any rumblings about that? You know, about what work's going on to rethink that?
Yeah, a little bit. Essentially, I mean, you might have heard across the pond about California sort of opening up in phases. So phase one, I think it was like restaurants started to serve dine in, but you know, with social distancing and wearing masks and things. And I think we moved into phase three now, so that we have gyms are now open and a few other things. And essentially, in television, they're doing something similar with phases. So there are phase one productions and phase two productions, and so on. I think for things like American Ninja Warrior that have large crowds, they might end up filming somewhere. You know, they might go to a state that has that is more open or never was on lockdown, so that they can get a crowd in a stadium potentially.
See. Yeah.
And then there's things like my show, the cow show, that I'm going to be working on. It's because it's a small family in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, on a large farm. That means that we can keep our crew a lot smaller, and their family has been, you know, sort of quarantining together. So we're considered to be a phase one production, which is why we're able to start as early as July.
I see.
Although the reason why they pushed it 2 weeks is because of spikes here, and thinking it might be dangerous to send people from a place where the numbers are spiking to a place that doesn't have spiking numbers.
That is so fascinating. I had not thought about the States, you know, the sort of, you know, the variation of the you know, the great experiment of the States in the way that you're unlocking everything. I had so not thought about industry tourism in that sense, like the fact that, you know, because obviously people have always looked to film and television where it's cheap, you know, but people have often less scrupulously looked to film and television where it's unsafer, you know, or where you can cut corners legally, and, you know, and I hadn't really thought about applying that to the easing of lockdown. That's actually kind of sinister, you know.
Yeah, and it's very unlikely that, you know, anyone's going to be filming in New York City anytime soon. Or, you know, making reality shows that, you know, involve putting the 20-somethings in the houses and trying to get them to touch each other. That's problematic.
Yeah, didn't stop Netflix though. I think that they got that one out just before I think.
Yeah, that's true.
I can't even remember what that show was called now, but that's.
Oh, was it? Oh God, I don't remember.
Was it like Too Hot to Handle or something like that, or something?
Yeah, there was something like that. And I spoke to somebody who works in scripted stuff, and they said that occasionally they've had offers where people are starting to think about doing things in like maybe August. But, you know, they're concerned about how much the production has really looked into it and is taking precautions. And so, you know, that person has no particular interest in taking jobs. You know, I think that jobs will be available, but it'll depend on your level of anxiety. And, you know, so far with the companies I've accepted work from, they are being very careful, and they're very clear about the ways in which they're being careful. And I appreciate that. But I know that there is some underhanded stuff going on where people are just haven't stopped working, even though they're not an essential business.
I'm sure.
Some TV companies.
Oh yeah, there'll be loads of exposés of, you know, this period and work practices, you know, and legalities of this for years to come, I'm sure, and you know, and attendant lawsuits, and union suits as well. I wanted to mention. There was an article, I can't remember, I'll put it in the show notes if I remember it, but there was an article recently in the UK that was talking about class and, you know, kind of like the back to work stuff in the UK, and he was basically saying that it's always been quite porous and debatable, you know, obviously people have been debating this for generations, you know, who belongs to the working class and who belongs to the middle class, you know, it's always been quite confusing, and it's to do partly with class background and social, you know, the work you do, but also the education you've had and all kinds of perceptions of people have of you. But someone was pointing out that one thing that this crisis has done is it's put down this really basic illumination between, you know, what you might call the new working class and the new middle class, which is that working class people have to go to work and middle class people don't. You know, they don't have to go somewhere.
Right.
And you know, and this crisis is really sorting us into that. We're not even doing it deliberately. It's just showing that, you know, like and it's exposing it, so because I'm someone who can work from home, and I was realizing in terms of TV, because you've had all these like celebrities making videos, but you've also got psychos like the traditional chat shows, your Trevor Noahs and stuff, the late night shows and stuff. You're exposing the people who can just do this work and can do it from home, all the way up to the higher paid professionals, your Ellens and stuff. But you still need people on the ground to an extent. You need the camera operators, you need the sound people on site. You need that.
Yeah, I guess that kind of goes along with the idea of sort of white collar work moving more into the digital and the technical, which can all be done remotely, versus sort of hands in the dirt kind of work, or sort of physical labor that tends to be associated to more working class stuff, and that requires people to show up. But then, there's a little bit of a divide with things like medical practices, very white collar, very middle class ideas of surgeons and doctors and all that. But that's very much physical labor, and so as far as I know, we don't have the technology to start doing remote robotic surgeries or patient care yet. So that kind of breaks down that divide a little bit.
I saw someone theorizing that there might be a bit of an animation boom. Obviously with animation it can't be overnight, but there might already be a lot of projects underway that are being rethought of as animated projects. A lot of stuff being pitched. Obviously that relies on certain working practices being observed in terms of the actual animation work as well. But
yeah, that's an interesting idea, and I wouldn't doubt that, especially if this went on for a much longer period of time, or we went back into lockdown. I could see that potentially happening, especially because you can do a lot of the audio work, a lot of the voice acting and stuff from home. I know for the Titan games, we record a lot of ADR after the fact. So basically the commentators on the show, because they haven't said enough interesting or good things during it, the producers, while they're editing it, will record their own voices as temporary voiceover, and then they'll come up with a script and they'll send it to the host of the show, and then they'll do reads of all that VO, and then we'll cut that into the show, as though they'd said it in the actual sort of stadium. And I remember there was one note on one of the episodes from an executive producer, and he said, "This sounds like it was recorded in a closet. Can we make it sound more like it was recorded in a stadium?" It's like, what? It was recorded in a closet. Don't know what you want us to do about that.
Yeah, a stadium is merely a large closet. If you really think about it, you're fired.
And one of the guys, he'd been given this sort of sound system to record from at home, but he'd accidentally turned one of the knobs and thought he had returned it back to its original position. But then we got all the ADR in from him, and it sounded distorted, and it's because it was all peaking. So you were losing some audio quality. We had to have him re-record the whole thing, which was a lot of, it was problematic money-wise and time-wise and a few other things. But, so there are some problems with leaving equipment with the talent. But there are a lot of ways that you can get this stuff done from home. So I could totally see that animation would have very little problem continuing. Whereas there would be potentially more problems with other productions, especially if things start to go back into more of a lockdown. But I really don't think they're going to lock things down again, just because of economy and money things, unless unless the hospitals do get really overwhelmed.
Well, there's. I'm glad you brought it onto that, because I was going to ask you a little bit about the sort of political and legal situation in the States at the moment, because you're already seeing a little bit of backtracking in Texas, aren't you? I read about that the other day. The bars are being reclosed as a result of I think specifically hospitalization stuff, right? Hospital capacity concerns. I said at the start of the podcast that Kat's joining us from LA. Obviously, you live in LA, and California is a very blue state. It's a very, or at least in recent decades, it's been a very safely democratic state in terms of the electoral college vote. So it's unlikely to be a battleground state in that sense. But obviously, I know it was quite an exciting place to be for political nerds during the recent Democratic primaries. Which seem a long time ago now, don't they? But
I think the last time we went red was Reagan.
I think it was actually, yeah. Reagan was it like the 84 particularly landslide, like his second election, it was just like, was it about 2 states were blue? It's so crazy.
Yeah.
When you talk about red state, blue state America, it's hard to remember how relatively recent that is. And then obviously in the mid 60s you've got Lyndon Johnson winning similarly blue landslides. You've got it's kind of, it's the red state, blue state feels, because of the time we've grown up, we're like kids of the noughties basically. It just seems so firm and implacable, doesn't it? The kind of roughly the battle lines drawn, and obviously states vary as we've seen recently, but roughly the battle lines of kind of the late 90s, the 2000 election are kind of considered quite intractable, and it's always just a question of which way Florida will go, which way Pennsylvania will go, but it's kind of, you forget it's not set in stone,
It's like playing Risk with your friends.
Yeah, yeah.
At the beginning which ones are just going to go to whoever, and then there's those ones in the middle. Just see who's going to get to it.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, yeah. I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about, because I was just doing the maths in my head, and it's about just over 4 months till the presidential election. This is again assuming. Okay, so firstly, I'm not seeing anyone seriously talking at the White House or below level of the election not happening. I know there was speculation about that earlier, that it could be delayed for 6 months, a year even. I'm not seeing any serious chat about that. In fact, I'm not seeing much chat about that stuff at all. Like logistically, people aren't really addressing that very much.
Well, there was talk of, doing mail-in ballots.
Mm-hmm.
Which a lot of people do anyway. But Trump is very against the idea and says that voter fraud will be, fraught. I think that he's worried that if people do mail-in ballots that he definitely won't win the election.
I think there might be a bit of that there, yeah. I was actually amused because it was almost like the Trump on the 2016 campaign trail again. Do you remember like before he became president, and he was kind of like, it was almost like that stopped clock thing where like mostly because he was attacking Republican rivals like Marco Rubio and stuff, but like every 20 comments he'd say something that a left-wing liberal person could agree with, because he was just giving out shit to the other people who were talking bullshit. And I almost thought this was like one of those moments where the mask almost slipped a bit, and he was just like, yeah, Republicans don't do well when mail-in ballots are done. We don't do well. And I was like, yeah, I know. I didn't really expect you to say it that blatantly, but and I'm not sure your advisors want you to, but it's kind of, yeah. Although I suppose when you say things like that, and you're just talking pragmatically, you're sort of dog whistling potentially to some of your followers, aren't you? Like about the reasons why that might be, and as you say, fraud,
right.
Perhaps particularly by or directed at, certain portions of the population. Yeah, it's not. I mean, as someone based in Britain, we're many years off another general election. Although we're hoping, local kind of regional levels of elections will recommence next year. As someone,
you had several elections in a small time, didn't you?
Yeah, we sure have. Recent British history has been we're kind of full. Yeah, I mean, at the top level, at the UK general election level, we will have the same government now for several years, barring unforeseen catastrophes of a massive nature. As someone who's actually looking down the barrel of this particular gun, of just over 4 months from now, you have another presidential. Like, how are you feeling about that? Because I mean, it's been quite a crazy year already. With even before COVID, the Democratic primaries were all over the place, weren't they? They were a real mess in exactly the way that the Republican ones were in 2016. It's kind of been inverted.
I think I'm disappointingly chill about it.
Yeah.
I remember talking to my grandpa once and him saying, "Oh, we always say that politicians used to be more honest and this, that, and the other thing." And he's like, "Honestly, they've always been scoundrels." And he's like, the sun will rise in the east, the sun will set in the west, and believe that'll keep happening.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that it would be interesting to see Trump not have another 4 years, since we've had a couple times in a row where we've had whoever's in office stay in office.
Yeah. The last one-term president was George H.W. Bush, wasn't it? And he kind of unexpectedly lost that, wasn't it? After essentially winning the Gulf War and stuff. It was.
Yeah.
You're right. It would be a bit of a shock to the system.
Yeah, because Clinton went for 8 years. So did George Bush. So did
and
Obama. So yeah, so it would be the first time, kind of in my lifetime, I guess, that we had a one-term president.
Yeah, certainly the first time in my sort of conscious political lifetime, because my even like slight awareness of American politics basically starts with Clinton, and I've spoken to we have a mutual American friend who grew up in Indiana, and she remembers Clinton as kind of her first president. She's about my age.
That was the same with me.
Yeah, it's do you and without getting too into the weeds in a partisan way or anything like that, because obviously I also don't want to assume your own feelings about it and biases and stuff.
Sure.
But when you talk to more left wing liberal leaning, and obviously that's a huge spectrum, but when you speak to more people who are probably going to vote Democrat, put it that way, around your area, do you get a sense of whatever their personal feelings about Joe Biden? Do you get the sense that he's generally thought to now be a barnstorming candidate, that he's generally thought to be heading for a likely victory? I mean, do you get a lot of faith? Are people feeling it?
I think people are a little bit resigned. I think they're like, I mean, we don't know a lot about Joe Biden, honestly. He's in so many memes, and he seems all right. He doesn't seem like a particularly bad man. Sometimes he doesn't seem to know what's going on. He kind of reminds me of like a batty professor, or like that one uncle who gets lost on his way to the punch bowl. But I still think it would be a little better.
I'm really glad you're not writing Republican attack lines, because I think they'd quite happily take both of those. If I see that show up in the Trump debate coming out of Trump's mouth, I'll know that you wrote that in.
I don't know. I honestly, with COVID stuff as well, I've stopped being anxious about really any of it, and just kind of watching with casual interest from a very, very distant place. I don't feel like I have any power in either situation, so I'm just kind of curious. And, like watching an ant farm that I'm particularly invested in.
One thing, yeah, no, I know the feeling. One thing, except for the investment.
Yeah.
One thing I was noticing the other day, because I follow, I'm a big politics nerd. I follow this stuff when I can. I've been a bit more out of touch than usually recently, just because work's been very busy. But I was seeing that there's a bill being put before Congress at the moment. I think it was started last week, which will obviously be vetoed by the Republican Senate and vetoed by the president himself if it got beyond that. But you might have read yourself, Kat. But it's the one about DC statehood. The Democrats are finally, partly as a result of the recent Black Lives Matter protests and Trump's deployment of the military to DC, the Democrats are basically congressionally trying to make DC, Washington DC, the 51st state. Which obviously locally there's been a clamour for that for decades.
Where do you think they'd put the star?
That's why they vetoed it. It's no bad faith on the Republican part. It's no political interest. It's just we just can't make it work aesthetically. We've tried. We've workshopped it. Trump's had a look, and he's very clever, and I don't know, it's just not working. So no. But I was just thinking, one of the, I guess because that bill will get vetoed. That bill's not going anywhere. But the fact that the Democrats are putting it forward is still notable. I suppose if you do have a massive Biden victory in November and possibly if the Democrats take the Senate, I know that's on the cards, obviously it's not dead cert at all, then you might actually, one of the things the Biden presidency might give you is a revival of that bill and a 51st state, which would actually be pretty crazy.
Yeah, but then I wonder if somebody came in later, they might just bring up that law again and undo it. I mean, it's like, remember all those things Obama did? And then Trump just got in and was like, no.
I suppose it's harder to take away statehood, isn't it? I mean, that might be trickier, not so untangled. But
you could take away universal health care.
I was just wondering about Puerto Rico. So Washington becomes the 51st state, and Puerto Rico's just standing over there like, guys. What? Who was that? Nothing. It was the wind. Anyway, I will definitely be checking in with you in subsequent months to see how both your television work's going, and also I'm sure I'll be getting your political thoughts on as it starts to really kick off, because obviously they've not even had the I forget what they call them, the sort of conventions yet, have the the equivalents, the Republicans and the Democrats. They usually have a roundabout now, kind of mid-July.
This is about the time when you'd start to expect conversations about that to happen, and I am curious about it. But yeah, it's just a circus.
Yeah. No, it sure is. But I'll definitely be seeking your thoughts about that in months to come, and I'll be really interested to have thoughts from yourself and my other few American friends who are kind of on the ground, to actually hear how that's going. So yeah, look forward to that. I'm just gonna take a little break now, and then me and Kat are gonna reconvene for this kind of other half of this podcast, basically, where we're going to discuss romantic comedies and dramas for a bit. So rom-coms, you might say. So we'll see you shortly.
Rommy-commies, we sometimes say.
No, we don't. See you in a bit. Welcome back. Kat, the sort of putative main reason that we're doing this podcast today, and we kind of talked a little bit about what we were going to focus on today, and we had some different ideas, is mostly rom-coms, although we're definitely talking, at least in our main focus today, about things that could be termed like proper, I guess this is a very fine line, but like proper romantic dramas, and I actually want to discuss with you, like, briefly a little bit what the difference between a rom-com and a romantic drama might be. But the three main movies, we'll be chatting about a few movies, but the three main movies we're looking at today in sort of reverse chronological order are 500 Days of Summer, which came out in 2009, When Harry Met Sally, which I think came out in 87, 88?
I think it was 88, and that's just because I remember clocking that it was the same year I was born.
There you go. Yeah, that'll probably be it. Good research.
Oh, wait, no. 89.
89.
Released July 21st, 1989. Thank you, Wikipedia.
89. Through the magic of editing, it will just seem like I knew the answer all the time. And Annie Hall, which came out in 1977. So we're going to kind of roughly go in, as I say, in reverse order through those main movies, but we'll talk about some other associations before. Kat, just before we get into any of that at all, I was only just thinking about this when I was rewatching 500 Days of Summer today. What do you think the difference between a rom-com and a romantic the obvious answer is the comedy, of course, but I want to go a bit deeper with you than that. Do you have thoughts? Because I've got a thought.
Well, one ends in a funeral and one ends in a wedding, right? That's.
I believe it's something.
Oh,
like
no,
that,
that's Shakespeare.
Some old Greek guy said that. That's you don't want to listen to him. What I mean, I suppose I'll phrase it a little bit better.
Sure.
Something like 500 Days of Summer. In fact, all these three films are comedies. They're definitely comedies to an extent.
Yeah. But
they are both also. I'd say all of them are serious, dramatic, present like examinations of relationships. But I think what I was thinking is, because rom-coms, we'll talk a bit about the sort of gender implications of this, but rom-coms are often sneered at by and historically have been sneered at by contemporary film critics, nascent film critics in the early decades of cinema, but by recent film critics and that's often because they're perceived as entertainment for women, and often even immature women. They're often considered entertainment for girls, essentially. Right, and I think a good part of talking about Annie Hall will be it's a certain point where they were considered to become more than that. It was like a leveling up in terms of mainstream critical opinion for them. I was thinking
the common thought was that you're basic.
Yeah.
If you watch rom-coms.
Yeah, well put. Yeah, and they're kind of actually in terms of that. Just before I forget, that I read a quote. I really want to attribute this, so I'll look this up after the podcast. But someone once described Dirty Dancing as the star. I think the quote was "Star Wars for girls," which I think is such a really interesting comment, because what they meant by that, I think, was like partly a generational thing. It was like an iconic 80s movie, 70s 80s movie that people grew up with. But they also meant that it was a certain kind of comfort food. I think, like a sort of quotable, iconic, scene after scene after scene that influences you, comfort food. But the implication is girls don't care about Star Wars, which has always been always been debatable, going right back to the 70s, but it certainly doesn't hold up very well now.
And and also Dirty Dancing had such strong world building.
Yeah, who can forget the cantina scene? Actually, Dirty Dancing is totally the sort of film that would have a cantina scene.
And how the ballroom dancers have their own language. It's really impressive.
Yeah, I'm just imagining them dancing now to the cantina band, like do the leap. I actually, brief sidebar, I saw Dirty Dancing quite late on, and it was a partner, I think I was in my early to mid 20s, introduced me to it, and I was actually kind of like a little bit shocked because it was because if anyone's seen, I guess many of our listeners will have seen Dirty Dancing, but it is a romantic coming of age drama, and the coming of age bit it includes a lot of what you might call kind of abuses of care, and a lot of kind of very dubious decisions taken by vulnerable teenagers, and it's just there's a lot. I didn't think it was bad. I actually really enjoyed it, but I just thought it was quite a lot to it. I was kind of like, a lot of this leaves me with quite awkward feelings. Like, is it meant to? I don't know. To its credit. I should say.
I mean, did they take advantage of Luke in these situations?
Yeah. Oh well, if you want to talk about dubious parenting, I think Obi-Wan Kenobi could have a few stones flung at him. But
oh sure.
Yeah, but so I'll talk to you. What I wanted to say about rom-coms is I think in the sense that anyone, myself included, sometimes dismisses them. What I'm often thinking about is kind of high concept rom-coms, and what by that I mean. Yeah. In a sense, low concept, because but gimmicky. I'm talking about things like Runaway Bride is probably like a really easy example to scoff at. The gimmick is the challenge is you're trying to marry a woman who always runs away at the altar. That's the sort of rom-com this is. It's a specific kind of gimmick. It's got an elevator pitch attached to it.
Like Crazy Rich Asians.
Yeah. Actually, ethnic minority focused rom-coms are like a whole other subgenre, aren't they? Big Fat Greek Wedding being one that's more contemporary to 500 Days. I think the things like 500 Days of Summer, When Harry Met Sally, and Annie Hall, that although they obviously got tropes of their own, and they obviously Annie Hall created some of those or codified some of those tropes, they're less easy to reduce to an elevator pitch, aren't they? They are a pitch. However, with whatever flaws they have, they are a pitch of a relationship. They're not really a gimmick,
I think sort of the classic basic rom-com is that whole boy gets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back, and it's largely inconsequential and left with a idea of that there's a happy ending beyond this. I used to joke that the beginning of a relationship is a rom-com and an actual relationship is a sitcom.
Yeah, at best.
At best, yeah.
Yeah. We'll get into this more specifically, but it's interesting that two of the movies we're talking about today don't end with the couple in question together, and the narrative doesn't end with the couple together. It ends with them parting company or having parted company, and When Harry Met Sally is the exception to that, but it involves most of the movie, whether there even should be a couple is kind of at least explicitly a question,
Yeah, because that's set over like 25 years or something between those two people. It's almost like it could have ended at any point and been more like Annie Hall or 500 Days of Summer, but instead the movie keeps going until they actually do get together.
Yeah. I think I've got a different. I don't think I ever dismiss. I think like many teenage boys, who have relatively conventional sort of ways of looking at the world. I think I was probably there was probably several times in my life when I was a bit dismissive about rom-coms. But I'll get into this when we talk about Annie Hall a little bit more. Because I'm a teenage Woody Allen fan. Basically, it sounds like a drive-in movie, doesn't it, from the 50s? I was a teenage Woody Allen fan. But I want to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about Annie Hall and how that may have shaped some of my reactions to the genre. But I was thinking when watching 500 Days of Summer today, because my background with 500 Days of Summer is I watched it about a decade ago because you recommended it. So this is when it was quite new.
Oh, really? I didn't know it was based on my recommendation.
It was, yeah, and I think it was based on conversation about Annie Hall, because I said I like Annie Hall very much for the following reasons, and you were like, oh, you might be interested in watching 500 Days of Summer. It's definitely playing in some of the same waters as that, and I was like, oh, okay, cool. I watched it, and I realised that I didn't remember it. I mean, I talked to you about it at the time, I think, but this would be like 2010. So we're actually literally doing 10 years on revisitation of it, Right. And I didn't remember it too well because I was realising, like, when I got to the scene where I always forget his name, the actor, the Batman guy, Joseph Gordon-Levitt. I always forget. Just anyone with three names, I always find it hard to pass that out. Joseph Gordon-Levitt.
It's just one too many to remember.
When you get to the iconic scene, probably the scene most people remember from 500 Days, where he dances. It's the first night they've slept together, and he dances. I'd completely forgot even what song it was to. Like I was surprised to remember it was Hall & Oates. And he does that whole routine. When I watched it, it at the time I was reacted to it, but a lot of it I was coming to pretty fresh because I didn't remember too much of it this time. And it was interesting because I'd actually watched Annie Hall earlier this week. I'd watched Harry Met Sally about a month ago with my family. We had a family viewing of it, so they're all relatively fresh in my mind. Do you remember? Because I think you were quite impressed with 500 Days of Summer at the time when it came out, weren't you? Did you? What did you like about it?
I think I found it very relatable. I've spoken to some people sometimes, and they hate Summer's character. And I find that it's very particular kinds of people who tend to hate Summer's character. Mostly men.
Sure.
But there were just parts of it to me that I thought were so true of what it felt like to be in love or to be infatuated, and then to be really frustrated or really resentful, or even have contempt for somebody. Especially that part where there's those beauty close-ups of different parts of Summer, and he's describing how much he loves each of these little details, and then later it's the exact same things, except now he's really annoyed by those little details. And I was like, oh, that hits me really hard in the I get it department kind of place.
Yeah, it's almost a good meta editing joke as well, isn't it? Or voiceover. Yes. Voiceover over editing joke. I know I like that bit. I actually thought my reaction to it today, and actually one thing I want to talk about a little bit in relation to all these films is how we're now, at least with this movie and the others, we're now older than when we first saw them, because that really watching 500 Days of Summer at 24 for me was a very different experience to now watching it when I'm 34 years old, because you've been through more relationships, you've been through more cycles of relationships, but also I think when we saw it first, we were probably closer to the age they're meant to be in the film, because they're both kind of relatively fresh out of university, maybe been working a few years kind of stuff. It came out in 2009, and I think there's a little bit of topicality to the fact that they're talking about underachieving in the workplace as a result of a recession. There's kind of there's an implication right. that Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character is kind of not one of the reasons he might not be being an architect, because that's his sort of quashed ambition in that, and is instead working for a greeting card company. They never mention it explicitly, but I think there's implications of that. And obviously we all had to curb our career ambitions a little bit back in the last recession.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The other thing that kind of dates the film is that it was kind of pre-Tinder and Bumble and all of the sort of dating apps and ways that we now so often connect with people and find romantic connections. And I think entering into an age where romantic connections became a little bit more commonly fleeting, frequent fleeting connections, and the idea of, I just want to get on to an app and see if I can connect with anybody. It was very much still meeting people in the wild.
It's strange. It's one thing that makes it seem quite dated, isn't it? Or not dated exactly, but quite staid, quite traditional. Is that in 500 Days of Summer they meet at work. They're colleagues. She's a new colleague of his, and that almost seems. Obviously people still meet at work and fall in love. But it does seem it's very not finger on the pulse, isn't it? If you even fast forward 3 years after that,
Yeah, but that's also not to say that any romantic comedies that are more recent really heavily involve dating apps anyway. It's probably, there's a little throwaway comment to it, just want to get off of Tinder, or I've been swiping for, I don't know, my thumb is so tired from swiping, I wish I could just have a meet cute.
Yeah, I suppose the challenge of that, and I'm sure there are examples of this that we don't know about, but the drama in the dating app rom-com would be the selection, wouldn't it? You kind of the winnowing out of the field. It would be harder to focus more specifically on one relationship without making it more of a, okay, we're off the app now, we're talking about the real relationship.
I did think that one thing I loved about Crazy Rich Asians is how they dealt with texting, and how they brought that into it in such a creative and cool and interesting way, because so much of our social interactions now are through things like that, and it's difficult visually for films because it's very boring to watch somebody on their phone. and they're kind of disconnected with the world around them. But yeah, they did that whole is it a sequence, I guess, of showing like how information was spreading through text and had all these emojis and cool animation, and I thought that was just fantastic. But you do have to get really creative.
And that has rom-com implications, doesn't it? Because it's about the transmission of private messages, intimate messages, you might say, to the audience, isn't it? You know, so it's kind of that. I can never pronounce this properly, but the epistolary, is that the word? The letters worked into a narrative. It's that for the modern age. You know.
I want it to be a word, so I'll give it to you.
Yeah, no, I'll just re-record it. It's okay. I'll put it in properly pronounced by Ian McKellen. I'll just drop that in. I want to talk you talking about the unlikability of some audience members. This is Zooey Deschanel, pre New Girl, isn't it? You know, I certainly know a lot of. I know a lot of. I actually knew more male viewers of this and her subsequent work that fell in love with Zooey Deschanel. I think, you know,
really?
Although I suppose she's more. I actually have some thoughts about the character she's playing in this specifically, because I think I've not seen much of New Girl, but she's very lively and kind of likable in that, you know, lovable, I'd say, by and large, you know, like very witty and stuff, you know. In this, I actually find the character of Summer like really interestingly kind of a bit blank, and I genuinely, like, before anyone gets the wrong idea, I don't mean that as a criticism. I think she seems quite deliberately detached and you know, wants to be detached. Obviously that's part of the plot, you know, but I think it's quite an interesting performance from her, actually. And I think it is a bit off-putting to an extent for a romantic like drama or comedy lead. It's because she kind of, the whole plot is partly about a question of how much she wants to be there or wants to be committed, you know.
Yeah, I think the people that I knew who really didn't like her in the film, they felt like, oh yeah, this is totally what women do and it's unfair, and I hate her for being such a heartbreaker, and she reminds me of somebody who broke my heart or something along those lines, you know. And when I watched it, I was like, but she was always clear with him about what she wanted, and he never checked in.
So you have a boyfriend?
No.
Why not?
Because I don't want one.
Come on, I don't believe that.
You don't believe that a woman could enjoy being free and independent?
Are you a lesbian?
No, I'm not a lesbian. I just don't feel comfortable being anyone's girlfriend. I don't actually feel comfortable being anyone's anything, you know?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Really?
Nope.
Okay, let me break it down for you.
Break it down.
Okay. I like being on my own. Relationships are messy and people's feelings get hurt. Who needs it? We're young. We live in one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Might as well have fun while we can and save the serious stuff for later.
Holy shit, you're a dude. She's a dude.
Okay, but wait. What happens if you fall in love? What?
Well, you don't believe that, do you?
It's love, it's not Santa Claus.
Well, what does that word even mean? I've been in relationships and I don't think I've ever seen it.
Well, maybe that's...
And most marriages end in divorce these days. Like my parents.
Okay, mine too, but...
Methinks the lady doth protest too much.
The lady dothn't. There's no such thing as love, it's fantasy.
Well, I think you're wrong.
Okay, well, what is it that I'm missing then?
I think you know when you feel it.
I guess we can just agree to disagree.
And is it one of his friends? No, it's the girl he goes on a date with towards the end, or like 2/3 of the way through, who sort of points that out to him in black and white. She's kind of like, wait, let's replay this. She told you up front. She never messed you around, you know. She just politely told you that she doesn't see you. Why are you angry? And he doesn't really answer that. He kind of just starts doing angry drunken karaoke, you know. But I think that's deliberate. You know, that's deliberate. I think that, you know, he is meant to be a flawed character, obviously.
I think it's also, you know, quite common in things that happen, you know, in relationships today as well, because you can kind of assume that things have changed and not wanted to have the conversation to prove that wrong, and so you just go with the assumption that the other person's on the same page as you, which I think is hugely problematic.
Definitely.
remember listening to a podcast not too long ago about sort of science of romantic relationships, and one of the things that they were saying is that there are two minds in any given relationship, and the likelihood that both of those minds are going to be in the same headspace is next to zero in literally every situation.
Yeah. Well, I certainly have previous ultimately failed relationships in my past where I just realized I only realized after the relationship was over how little we were talking to each other, or how little we were talking about a specific topic, difficult area of our relationship, and sometimes it took the end of the relationship for me to actually gain some perspective and go, oh yeah, we just didn't talk about that was a problem. And you often don't realize you're doing that at the time, do you, unless you have a really good therapist.
Yes.
I was wondering, there's one bit where Summers, it's after he gets into a fight for her honour, at a bar, and they have an argument, and she comes to his house and they kind of make up, but he also says, like, I just need to know that you're going to feel the same way, like every day, or like tomorrow morning you're going to wake up and feel the same way about me. And she's like, I can't. They like hug and she kisses him, and then she's like, I can't promise you that. No one can promise you that.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a really nice line in the film. It was almost it was kind of like more blunt than most rom-coms would go.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons why I love it so much, is because there's parts of it that kind of tear down the tropes of rom-coms. It actually made me kind of angry when he meets Autumn at the end, especially because she's so typically beautiful.
Autumn. I was going to mention Autumn. That was ridiculous.
Yeah.
That was a step too far.
I just think that's so cringy, and I didn't want it to happen. I'm not sure how they could have dealt with it differently, but
well, I didn't mind it, because they're both interviewing for a job, and he asks her out, he goes back and asks her out. But then I thought, which is nice, but then I thought that and she says oh, no, I can't really. I'm meeting someone else, in case she's kind of taken already. I thought that would have been a better note. Have him just be mature enough to go, okay, fine, I'm glad I asked.
Yeah. And
just walk off, get his swagger back a little bit, but kind of, yeah. And sometimes they're taken already, that's fine.
Yeah.
But still glad he asked. I thought that would have been a nice note,
Yeah, I think that would have been a better ending. I think I just wanted that character to be a little bit more real. It felt like you were in his fantasy, because the fact that she just looked like a model, and the fact that her name was Autumn, and I was just like, ugh.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely, I think there's a deliberate, from the little I read about the movie, there's a deliberate effect by the writer and the director, etc., and the actors to make you, it's almost like, it's not a Usual Suspects level twist ending or anything, but or twist on the rom-com, but it is a little bit, you are kind of meant to be seeing his idealized view of their relationship, aren't you, to the point where his sister, towards the end, his sister giving him advice, explicitly sort of says, you need, I think she says something like, next time you think about this, you need to take a closer look, or you need to reconsider.
Yeah.
And then you see a sort of montage of kind of, actually quite similar to some of the Annie Hall montage of their relationship, where you kind of see the emphasis put on maybe the difficult bits a little bit more, Yeah, which I liked. Actually, I meant to mention the sister very quickly, because she's not a huge part of the movie, but she reminded me of one of my mum's favourite movies, and one of mine growing up as well is a British, specifically Scottish movie, Gregory's Girl, which came out in the early 80s, which is super low budget high school relationship comedy, filmed in a Scottish new town. But the main feature of that is Gregory, the male protagonist, gets supernaturally wise advice from his little sister. She's like this impossibly wise 12-year-old, and he gets advice from her. And that bit in Summer I didn't remember at all, and it really seems like a tribute to that almost.
Yeah, I haven't seen any Scottish rom-coms. not a subgenre I've explored.
There aren't that many, and it's quite an old one, but it's very well loved in Britain. It's a loved classic.
I think one of the reasons why I thought that sort of Annie Hall and 500 Days of Summer, had a lot of overlap was even just the way the two kind of played with conventional film, linear narrative stuff. Especially with 500 Days of Summer bouncing back and forth in time, which was really pleasant for creating little bits of dramatic irony, because you'd go back to a moment and be like, oh, this isn't going to end well, which just adds to some of the scenes. But then also things like that dancing scene with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, where it suddenly becomes a musical, or it plays with the genre swaps, loose and fast. And also those that subtitles scene in Annie Hall when they seem to be having small talk, but then the subtitles are kind of ramping up in
Yeah, yeah.
flirtatiousness. Oh, and then the party scene where it's like the what he wants to happen and what is actually happening. Like those remind me really strongly of each other.
That's such a good link, and that's interesting, isn't it? Because we just mentioned the transmission of intimacy through text, and that can extend to inner thoughts. Like literally in Annie Hall, it's not even their text; it's their literal thoughts. So that's something that Annie Hall is giving, like to arguably from other influences like art films and stuff. But it's giving to the genre, I guess. I just wanted to talk. I thought it would be sort of irresponsible to talk about 500 Days of Summer without at least briefly mentioning the Manic Pixie Dream Girl thing, because I believe the filmmakers, either beforehand or certainly at the time it was released, they had that pointed out to them, that this is playing with that stuff. I imagine most of our listeners know a bit about the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope because it's been so ingrained. But I think it was coined in the mid-noughties before this movie came out, and it's not it's essentially, forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, Kat, but it's essentially the idea of male protagonists, or guys in real life as well, but male protagonists imbuing women with their hopes and dreams and the emotional support and help and stimulation that they need without really considering their either female characters or real women to be real rounded people. Basically, it's essentially using, maybe politely, but using women for your emotional gratification, really, and fulfillment.
Yeah, I mean, I'd never heard of it described that way, but that's very insightful. Yeah, I mean, to me, the Manic Pixie Dream Girl thing was this sort of like emotionally detached, but so different and always quite beautiful. Creature is like, oh, I just can't figure them out. They're, but there's also this kind of always happy thing. I don't know. It's that sort of classic trope now of how women kind of advertise themselves on dating apps, where it's like they love going on adventures and they love spontaneous road trips.
Yeah.
And just making so many aspects of their life sound quite exciting.
Yeah, and also transferable, like kind of imprintable. Like I want vaguely described thing. This might apply to you and your desire, your very specific desires. Like it's kind of that passive kind of receptacle for other people's desires and fantasies, isn't it?
Yeah, and I don't know if it kind of came out of situations in rom-coms, but I think there is this idea of the idealized beautiful woman who might take your hand and break you out of your normal 9 to 5 world and take you into some secret garden or something that just kind of gets you out of this sort of gray zone and makes your whole world really colorful.
I think in some ways that's probably quite a potent male and female fantasy, and whatever your sexual orientation. But I think drawing on some of my experience, I think what that is a revival of that first love thing.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, like it's that kind of, because if you are lucky enough to fall profoundly in love in your mid late teens or your early 20s or whenever it happens for you, that does tend to change you quite a lot, and it tends to feel very much like, both at the time and in retrospect, it tends to feel like you were taken out of your comfort zone. Like, obviously you found a new connection, but also that your world was expanded, isn't it? It's like a Hyrule Field moment, you might say. Your world is suddenly leveled up, and kind of your senses are re-stimulated, and your experiences and your opinions and politics and everything, is changed. And I think what you see in 500 Days of Summer is that early workplace. So you're getting more into your mid-20s, late 20s even, and you see them playing with the idea of like the rekindling of that, like looking for that love again that will change your world, and I think the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope is a bit, from the male perspective, male writer's perspective, is that basically.
Yeah, and maybe it's also that you expect like most teenage women to kind of have those qualities, that kind of Manic Pixie Dream Girl quality. And you might have had a sort of high school relationship, you might have had a relationship in university, but at this first stage of working life, you might be looking for an escape that kind of pulls you out of this sort of adult world that you've found yourself now trapped in, especially if you're not in the career that you want to be in yet, which frequently in people's early careers they're not immediately where they want to be. And so I think for him it replaces that need to feel special because you've worked hard and are in the career that you want to be in or feel appreciated, you know, in that sense. Yeah, I think it's kind of using hormones as your drug to distract you from not being where you want to be.
Well, and it's interesting you mentioned the career frustration aspect, because it's just reminding me that you could also link, after the events at 500 Days of Summer, to that kind of workplace rom-com, which is probably typified best by The Office, both the UK and US version, where you've got that Tim and Dawn, Pam and Jim thing, where part of what their connection is they're both basically encouraging each other not to be there anymore.
Yeah, or not to be there in the moment, to be silly, or to be making jokes, or to have these little schemes kind of running, in the background.
And often the tension in those things comes from the fact that you might successfully persuade the other person that they are better than this and they'll leave, but you haven't.
Yes. Yeah.
And both versions of The Office play with that a bit, I just wanted to this is kind of a personal question, so it may or may not end up in the podcast, but I just want to ask you, because I'm going to talk a little bit about this when we get to Annie Hall. Do you think, like in your dating history and stuff, either since seeing 500 Days of Summer or leading up to it, etc., do you think you've ever kind of consciously or chosen in a chosen way, or just subconsciously, or just found yourself in this situation? Do you think you've ever been the manic pixie dream girl?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably have to ask them. There was one relationship that I had, which is very funny, because it was the first time I wasn't really interested in asking that, like, oh, what are we question. I was actually kind of interested in pursuing somebody else at the time, and I was kind of into the idea of still being single, but having this person that I could go to sometimes. And it got out of control and ended up being like a 3-year thing where we never talked about being in a relationship and never discussed our boundaries. And both of us would occasionally just disappear on the other person, and then we would reconnect. One of us would reach out to the other one and we'd kind of like be back on. And we didn't really discuss it until we were talking about it retrospectively, because I was engaged to be married to somebody else and we still hadn't talked about it. Yeah. So I think in that case, I definitely felt like I was, especially because I liked being like, oh, let's go to this place, this like, funky little thrift store, and then we'll just like see where the day takes us, and tried to do these weird, fun, interesting things, and always, keep it kooky, I guess.
And you see there another part. I mean, I was talking about the manic pixie dream girl trope more, but you see there another part of Summer's character, isn't it? Which is the modern, it sounds so old-fashioned to say this, isn't it? The modern working career woman who's also trying to maintain a modicum of control and autonomy, and actually where useful, ambiguity about her romantic status, because she doesn't want to be tied down, and she doesn't want to be, like most women in history, selected by a man or a group of men, and that's her lot. She doesn't know what she wants. It's interesting that she ends up married at the end of the movie.
Yeah, I do find that interesting.
Do you think a lot of male viewers' anger about her was to do with that ending? Because he's certainly, Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character is certainly angry at her, at least initially in that conversation, and it's partly seen as like the rapidity of it. She's gone from wanting ambiguous, you might say modern 21st century kind of relationships, to suddenly she's doing the most traditional thing a woman can do.
I think that the thing that makes people angry about it, it's like people who've been married to somebody and that person said they didn't want kids, and then they end up with somebody else and then they have kids. And it's this kind of realization that it's not that they didn't want children, it's that they didn't want children with you.
And again, she's not quite that cruel as but Summer kind of makes that explicit to him. She's kind of like, you were right about me, but not about our relationship. You had insights about me, but they did not apply successfully to your relationship, but they do. They now do with my husband.
Yeah, and it's sad. It's like it's crushing. So much of it seems to me like us not being able to really lean in and talk about our feelings for fear of shame or fear of judgment or fear of the answer that we might get back in return. And I think about things like attachment styles, where when somebody's really anxiously attached, they're obsessed with the relationship and are worried that any little thing that they do in the relationship might be the end all and be all of it. And if you are really like swept up into the hormones and the elation of that whole falling in love process, and you have been in a place where you haven't experienced that in a while, I think it's very easy to latch onto it and not want it to go away and try and do anything you can to make it not go away, and then ironically end up doing all these things that actually could potentially spell out the end of it. But, you know, for me, thinking about having been married and going through the whole process of that, and then, you know, becoming separated, it just made me think so much about how much work and time and experience goes into building a relationship up to the point where you're actually living together and married and potentially having children, and how many boxes you have to tick along the way. You know, because when you go back to square one and you start dating again, you just go, oh my God, like, I don't know how to do this part, you know, of the relationship, or any of the parts in between, or like, how do I talk to this person?
And you actually see that in both 500 Days of Summer and Annie Hall, don't you, where you get the experience of trying to recreate first dates or like early romantic experiences. In Annie Hall, famously with the lobster scene.
Yes.
But in 500 Days of Summer, he's actually doing the karaoke, the drunken karaoke, because it helped him bond with Summer, and the new date's just like, this is clearly messed up. What are you doing? You know?
Yeah. Like, I think, you know, the terrifying thing about it is that, you know, it's all this time and commitment, and then you get up to a point where at any point either of those people could just suddenly end it. You know, it could take you 3 years to build up a, you know, a really strong relationship. And it can end in a moment.
I suppose it's easier said than done, isn't it? But I suppose the platonic ideal is like to see that as not lost time. You know, it's like, it's definitely spent time, but it's like, it's time you've still got, you've built up, and you still have that construct. You know, even if the relationship's over, you've earned all that. You know, and it's part of you. And obviously that's a lot easier if you're on good terms with your ex. You know, that helps salve the whole thing. You know, you know, which is why I so hugely value my friendships that are with exes. You know, that are still successful, breathing friendships. You know, it's kind of, it's a really special kind of friendship, isn't it, when you're lucky enough to have that?
Yeah, and I do know some people who have tried to do kind of a conscious uncoupling sort of situation, where they tried to map out the end of their relationship. I'm thinking about like of one couple in particular, and that ended up being like a very, I don't know, I guess it's a little bit like a 500 Days of Summer situation, because in that case, this guy had been dating this girl for so long, and then she was going to be going away to college, and he had stayed kind of local for college. And so they decided they were going to start to, you know, they had this whole list of things that they would stop doing, you know, in what time frame they'd stop doing those things, until they were like, and now we're not together anymore. But that couple had never slept together, and I knew it was something that was very important to the boyfriend, and the girl had been quite religious and decided that she wasn't really ready for it. And then she started working at a restaurant over the summer and met somebody there. And while they were still doing this conscious uncoupling thing, like almost immediately slept with that waiter that she worked with. And it destroyed the boyfriend, like absolutely destroyed him.
Right. Because she wasn't sticking to the plan, in a sense. She wasn't. She was introducing a rogue element.
Yeah, because she wasn't sticking to the plan, and because, and also because she never slept with him.
Right. Of course, yeah.
So this all these things that she'd said about the reasons why it wasn't something she was going to do, you know, was more about, I don't want to sleep with you. Yeah. Rather than, these are all the reasons, you know, for
I think I'm a relationship idealist in some ways, and I do think we can do things better as men and women, and yeah, we can make relationships as good as they possibly can be. I am enough of a traditionalist though to think that probably the ends of at least monogamous, romantic, like intimate relationships probably do have to be a bit unpleasant. You know, like they kind of. I don't mean they should. I don't mean it's good they are. I just mean they have to be. You know, because it's a tearing away of a very special bond, or at least temporarily. You know, at least. It's the knocking down of what you thought it was for something new, you know, and that's why the best...
Oh, it's absolutely traumatic.
Yeah, and that's why the best reconstructed friendships are, you know, after that, whether it takes you years, you know, because I'm old enough now to have exes who our relationship ended was often quite brief, and ended like literally decades ago now. And that's why those friendships feel great, because you when they are successfully reconstructed, they're not always, of course, not all of mine might have been, but there's so much layering there. It's so complicated, so nuanced.
Yeah, and sometimes you can come back as well and suddenly be able to have those conversations about the things that were uncomfortable or frightening to have at the time. So, sometimes you're the most open and honest with people that you're not actually, as close to anymore.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a level of detachment there. But I think with that sort of stages of uncoupling thing, it reminded me of how confused I was as a child about how people get into intimate relationships. And I remember asking my parents, and I felt weird and ashamed after, like, based on their reaction to my question. But, I was just saying, like, how does it start happening? How do you go from, like, two people standing 6 feet away from each other to two people being intimately involved? And nobody told me, oh, well, frequently it's alcohol.
Yeah. I suppose that's that pre-sexual thing as well, isn't it? If you're asking as a kid, you may have heard about sex, but you also you don't really feel, you understandably don't feel it, and you don't have no idea about the reality of sexual attraction and that kind of chemistry. So it's all very abstract.
And at the time, for me, I was so young. I think I was mainly just talking about, like, kissing. I was like, how do you go from not kissing to kissing all the time?
Still a very good question.
And to this day, I'm still not sure. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we might be doing it completely wrong. We should probably check.
Yeah, I think so frequently I had kind of relied on alcohol or making suggestions and waiting for somebody to to kiss me. But then when I started doing a lot of dating, I would just be like, so should we kiss now?
I remember, this story makes me sound much more of an arsehole than I am or was, hopefully. But I ended up saying one of my first, like, proper kiss, like the first kiss with someone who then became a proper relationship, basically. And I was 17, and I was talking to her, and she was. I found out later a bit more details about her. She'd been keen on me for a while, and I was quite oblivious to it. And she basically told me that she liked me a lot. And I remember being quite blindsided by it, kind of a bit overwhelmed as a teenage boy. But I said, and this sounds like a Ham Solo line or something, but it really wasn't cool. It was just more awkward. But I was kind of like, I suppose we kiss now, right? It's like, that was like, and I think it sounded that bad. It was like that indifferent. It was kind of like, do it. Is that a bit now that we do? And and then we did, and it was really nice. But I don't know how I got away with any of that. Ridiculous. Because I know I've not got you forever, Kat. I just want to move on from 500 Days of Summer and talk a little bit more about When Harry Met Sally. But just before we do that, I just wanted to note one of my things that I noticed today about 500 Days of Summer was the profession of Joseph Gordon-Levitt in it. Is he's writing greeting card slogans, and they kind of have a bit of stuff about how legitimate that is as a thing to be doing and how that works in terms of romance, which I found a bit surface level, really, but like. But it just made me think, because to tie it in slightly to our episode 5, where we were talking about AI and robots, and we've sort of tangentially mentioned the film Her, the 2013 film Her, because Joaquin Phoenix's role in that is it?
Oh, you've seen Her?
Her, yeah, oh yeah. I thought I might mention it. But Joaquin Phoenix's job in that, if you remember, is he's kind of like a higher level of that, isn't he? He's writing sentiments and like letters for people with romantic sentiments. So it's almost like a slight development of that 500 Days of Summer idea. Still as window dressing essentially, but it's quite similar.
I think it's a good choice, writing wise, especially, because you're getting an insight into this man's emotional roller coaster. And the idea of having to write sentiments on behalf of other people, I think is pretty great.
On a purely comedy level, I love the scene near the end when he has that rant about the whole industry essentially, and then quits, and then he's just walking out, he storms out, and his one mate is just like tries to start a slow hand clap, and then just like no one else joins in. He just stops him. He stops him after about 3 claps, but it's just such a great moment. I really enjoyed that. One of the, when we knew we were going to start talking about rom-coms, we both wanted to make an effort of talking about When Harry Met Sally, and as I said, that's partly because I watched it recently, but it was one that you mentioned as particularly liking, and we also thought it might be neat for us to talk about that a little bit, because we're male and female friends. you know, and we're not, and we've never been in a relationship, so it's kind of got that, and we've known each other for about 12 years now, so it's kind of
wow.
It's interesting to watch film, you know, and as I say, I know they do end up at the end of the film, and they're kind of implied to be like a long-term couple, you know, because they end up in that montage with the other people. But it's interesting as male-female friends to talk about those kind of narratives, isn't it, as a sort of twist on the rom-com? Because this documents a friendship, really. I mean, it's sort of a will. It's definitely a will they, won't they? Don't get me wrong. It's definitely a will they, won't they? But it's a story of a relationship which finishes when the relationship formally begins.
Yeah, I think it feels a lot more like watching a couple through a TV series, because it's going over, you know, this long period of time, and you see them, you know, with other people romantically, and then kind of come back to each other and kind of run into each other again. So it's much more like following a longer storyline of will they, won't they, which I think is kind of nice.
That's interesting, actually. Yeah, in that sense, it's like a condensed 10 seasons of Friends or something, isn't it? You can imagine like Harry Met Sally as a 10-season sitcom, like concertinaed out, you know. That's interesting.
And one thing I picked up on, like according to Wikipedia, is that the first time Harry meets Sally, or Sally meets Harry, this isn't a one-way street, it's in 1977 in Story World, which is when Annie Hall came out.
Interesting, yeah. They could have, if they wanted to be really cheeky about the somewhat lack of originality in some of the style of the film, they could have mentioned that.
Right, yeah.
I really like that. It's funny because they meet for a road trip as well, and you would just talk about the sort of Tinder dating profile type offer of being available for road trips.
Yes. I think one thing that I love about this movie was reading some kind of background information about it, that apparently the director had just gotten out of a marriage, and he was moving back into the dating world, and so he was thinking about dating and stories, and so he got together with Nora Ephron, and I think they were friends. I think they might end up actually together at some point. But yeah, the writer and he were basically collating all of their weirdest or most interesting dating stories, and decided to string it together into a script. So each of the characters are loosely based on one of them, and then I guess Billy Crystal got involved and made it funnier, made his own character, like, you know, quite funny. And then the couples, these like fictitious couples that they string throughout the film and tell a story of how they met. Those were actually real interviews with older couples, and then they fictionalized it. They're all the words that they're saying as part of the script are a direct transcript from the real interviews with these couples.
I see. So they're actors doing that, but they're based on real couple interviews, right?
Yeah, they're actors acting out the transcript of real couples, which I love as an idea of the sort of, you know, mixing documentary and fictional kind of filmmaking, especially because so much of it is based off of the director and writer's own experiences of dating. So there's this like blurry line of like the fiction and real situation in this film.
Especially when you have Harry and Sally crop up at the end as one of those couples.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually that links it back to The Office as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I could see it being linked to The Office that way. So that's what I find the most interesting about this film.
Yeah, I think I think Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan are both really good in it as well, you know, and I think they're both like they're different kinds of charismatic, you know, but they're both very charming. And I think, you know, I can see Billy Crystal's character being a bit much for some people if they don't like that kind of wisecracking thing that he does, you know, but like I find them both very charming anyway, and it's interesting to remember how charming and charismatic Meg Ryan was. I mean, I'm not sure what she's been doing recently as an actress, but she's kind of gone out of the cultural radar a little bit, hasn't she? Yeah, she's great, you know, and you do kind of fall in love with her and with them a bit, you know, like with them as a friendship. You have that it's that classic thing they're playing with at the start on the road trip, isn't it, where it's the couple who might be destined to be together but they hate each other, you know. It's kind of like they both come out of that experience not wanting to spend a minute more with each other, except I suppose you might say he's from the start he's got the sort of sexual conquest eye on her, hasn't he, you know. But she's certainly not having it, and he's not. He doesn't even really like her at the start. You know, he wouldn't mind sleeping with her, but he doesn't really get her or like her or click with her. You know.
And he does say that directly to her face, I think.
Yeah. There's stuff, in a late 70s, a late 80s movie, but set in the late 70s at the beginning, where you probably would have it be, some of their conversation be less explicit these days, a bit more couched in tact and diplomacy. Then again, you might not, I don't know. But yeah, it's interesting the way it does space out that, you get the styling of the couple throughout the year, because we've just been talking about 500 Days of Summer, which is set over, about a year and a half. But this is set, as you say, over like a decade, and you have, the classic way of set dressing and costume changes to indicate that passage of time, and you get to poke a bit of fun at the actors former styles. I think there's something, I looked this up, but there's something, I think Billy Crystal was at least 40 doing this. I think he was like 42, and I think in that first scene he's meant to be playing like mid-20s or something, and it is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen. Is like, because they've done it quite with his hair, they've darkened his hair a bit, given him a ridiculous collegey shirt to wear and stuff. But it is one of the more laughable elements of that I've ever seen, but he gets away with it.
I agree. I remember when I had just rewatched this, and I talked to you about it very briefly, and I was asking about sort of how the Bechdel test kind of applied to this film. Because of the fact that the men in this film are talking to each other almost exclusively about women and about relationships, and the women are doing the same. But if both genders are doing it, does it even it out?
Yeah, I remember you mentioning that. Yeah, I suppose in a sense it does, because you're presenting both sides of the conversation, or like both on separate sides of a wall. You're hearing both sides. I suppose it dodges it, or at least it mollifies it a little bit. The problem that the Bechdel test was set up to illuminate, it helps with a tad.
Yeah, I mean, you basically experienced 25 years of these two people's lives being obsessed with relationships.
Yeah.
Like, you don't really talk much about career stuff. You just kind of get a little bit of insight of how that shifts and changes over time, but it's kind of non-consequential.
And it's clear from quite an early stage of the movie, like a relatively early stage, that they are good friends. That they are good for each other, at least on a platonic level. And there's that ongoing kind of sexual tension. I mean, I suppose you could say it's the film I'd never really thought about this before, but one clever way in which the film kind of keeps awareness of sexual possibilities going with them is it includes the famous diner scene. Because it's quite bold. I mean, in '89, it's quite bold to have an actress.
I think that's why it became so famous.
Yeah, it must have been quite. It's a funny scene, but it must have been quite shocking to hear an actress simulate an orgasm, however jokingly done.
Yeah.
In a mainstream movie, And
I love the sort of making it less awkward, or like giving the kind of telling the audience like, no, you can laugh, don't worry, like you're okay, by saying that like, I'll have what she's having. Yeah,
I think the more subtle punchline of that is not the I'll have what she's having, but which is kind of a Billy Wilder-esque kind of cap on it. But I like the look that Meg Ryan gives him. When she goes back to normal, does she eat a piece of cake or something? It's just that look she gives him of like, how was that? It's kind of that's the more subtle punchline, I think, in that scene, and that's the bit that gets me going even before the line.
And the way he's looking at her that entire time is really entertaining.
Yeah, it is, and it's kind of a bit, because he's making her, whether reluctantly or not, he's making her laugh for a lot of the movie, and it's kind of a bit where she really takes control of the situation.
Yeah, I think I love that scene partly because it gives her so much agency that she doesn't really have in other parts of this film, this movie. She's kind of a blank slate. In a lot of ways, and it was cool to see her do that, because it's so bold. It gives her character a lot of oomph that she doesn't have before that.
Actually, it echoes this scene in 500 Days of Summer as well, where Summer's shouting out penis in the park, and he's getting her to like quiet down.
Yes, it's very similar to that. Yeah.
It's like it's again, you might be hitting Manic Pixie Dream Girl a bit there, isn't it? It's the girl who's doing things that are more outrageous than things you would do in public.
Yeah, the more boyish sort of associated behaviors of doing the lewd and crude and whatever and not caring or even wanting to have that attention and that sort of that very punk rock, like, oh, the grown-ups are going to be so disappointed in us. Aren't we cool?
And you both love her for.
I hear that's how punk rock works.
I think it's something like that, yeah. And you're both terrified of that and also admiring of it. It makes you fall in love more with that person, but you're also you know you wouldn't comfortably act like that. Certainly not without them around.
I know, I shouldn't have done it.
Harry, you're gonna have to try and find a way of not expressing every feeling that you have every moment that you have them.
Oh, really?
Yes. There are times and places for things.
Well, the next time you're giving a lecture series on social graces, would you let me know? Because I'll sign up.
Hey, you don't have to take your anger out on me.
Oh, I think I'm entitled to throw a little anger your way. Especially when I'm being told how to live my life by Miss Hospital Corners.
What's that supposed to mean?
I mean, nothing bothers you. You never get upset about anything.
Don't be ridiculous.
What? You never get upset about Joe. I never see that back up on you. How is that possible? Don't you experience any feelings of loss?
I don't have to take this crap from you.
If you're so over Joe, why aren't you seeing anyone?
I see people!
See people? Have you slept with one person since you broke up with Joe?
What the hell does that have to do with anything? That will prove I'm over Joe because I fucked somebody? Harry, you're gonna have to move back to New Jersey because you slept with everybody in New York, and I don't see that turning Helen into a faint memory for you. Besides, I will make love to somebody when it is making love, not the way you do it like you're out for revenge or something.
Are you finished now?
Yes.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I think that this film, like When Harry Met Sally, has a really good bridge over to Annie Hall, with Woody Allen Alfie being called over for the spider incident in the apartment, and when Meg Ryan's character breaks up with that other guy and calls Billy Crystal's character over to her apartment, and she's like crying and all that.
Is that the pretext for that? Is it that she's had a bad? I can't already. Even though I watched it a month ago, I can't remember why she calls him over. Is it because she's had a bad date? Basically,
I think it's actually a full breakup. I think the guy might have been cheating on her. I don't 100% remember, but she's very upset. But it's very much the come comfort me, come rescue me, and in both situations they end up hooking up.
It's it's interesting that latter kind of quarter of When Harry Met Sally, when they do hook up and they do sleep together, and instantly you watching it as an audience member, because I'd forgotten the structure of it really, and you watching it, you're like, you have this kind of oh no kind of pit of your stomach kind of feeling, because you're like, you kind of want them to hook up, but you kind of know this isn't the way for it to happen. She's too vulnerable and drunk, and he's going over for some of the wrong reasons as well. At the same time as supporting her genuinely, but it's kind of. And then you see his coldness in the morning, his confusion, coldness, and you instantly realize, oh yeah, this wasn't good. Yeah. And obviously the film spends its whole last act kind of dealing with that, and working out whether they can even have good conversations with each other anymore, let alone be a couple. Yeah. Because he ends up kind of like what we'd now call ghosting her a bit, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does.
Which is not a good thing for a friend to do.
No, the old
especially a friend of a decade.
The old Caspering, friendly ghosting.
Yeah, well, well put. But I think that's probably where Billy Crystal's character runs into his least likable phase, isn't it? Because you're kind of like, well, you're perfectly within your rights to not want a relationship out of this, but the fact you're doing this to your good friend of many, many years and not even answering her calls it's a bit more than just cowardice, isn't it? It's kind of
it's the first time he's been as unlikable as he was in the beginning, as the sort of slimy, I'd sleep with you, but I don't really like you kind of character from the start, which kind of makes you think, oh, when men become avoidant or commitment phobes, it's actually kind of going back to this early mentality of I don't really need anyone. And it's this sort of immature, frightened cowardice kind of mentality.
And it's interesting as well that that it has this in common with Annie Hall and not so much 500 Days of Summer. You are, by the end of the movie, at least portraying slightly older characters, so that you've seen them. I think have they both had have Harry and Sally both had marriages earlier in the film?
I think Sally has an engagement that's called off. And I think that
Right.
Harry actually gets married.
I think they do quite a good job, as far as I remember, of making those partners not too ridiculously unpleasant. Because
Yes.
that's something I really value in rom-coms. Is like, it's really, again, this is like when you talk about runaway bride-esque films. One of the easiest cliches to do is give the people a romantic choice, a dilemma, but make one partner ridiculously comically unsuitable. Like the cliche would be, he's the guy she's just marrying for the stability, or but he's an arsehole to everyone, and it's obvious to everyone they shouldn't be with her. Whereas it's actually much more complicated when you give them two viable choices, And I think that obviously it's not about those choices in Harry Met Sally, but I think the fact that they make their partners relatable, however briefly they're in the movie, they make them relatable figures and like attractive figures, and they're not monsters. They're just those relationships didn't work out.
Yeah, and I think that is much more believable. And I don't know, I feel like if you're really rooting for a couple to get together, you don't have to make the person that one of them is with terrible to still be rooting for the other relationship to happen.
There's a really good, I told you that we haven't got that much time here, but I told you I'd mentioned briefly that I'd been watching a couple of Disney straight-to-video things on Disney+.
Oh yeah,
recently.
how's that been going?
I haven't watched a lot of them, but I did watch The Little Mermaid 2, which came out in about 2000, and that's interesting the way it pushes things forward, and it does a sort of generational thing. Ariel has a daughter, and you can kind of imagine where that goes. The one I found, I've only watched a few, but the one I found most interesting by far so far was I watched Pocahontas 2, and that's interesting for a whole bunch of reasons. But one of the reasons it's so interesting is it's based on, obviously Pocahontas is a quasi-historical, well, a real historical figure, but the Disney version of it is quasi-historical. But Pocahontas 2 takes the kernel of what actually happened to the real life Pocahontas. That is, she goes to England. She goes to live and start a new life in England, and that obviously the historical Pocahontas did that. And in using that, I know it's a really interesting thing in being tied to that particular mast, or at least choosing to be tied to that particular mast. They end up doing a really interesting thing that I've not seen in any other Disney movie, because in the real life Pocahontas may or may not have met John Smith. But she then went to England and married another dude, confusingly also called John, which I'm surprised they kept in the movie. You'd think they might change that for ease. But basically, she ends up in the sequel. She ends up having to choose between John Smith and this equally nice, guy she has problems with at first. Again, it's a bit like Harry Met Sally. There's a bit of misunderstanding and patronizing on both sides. But by the end of the film, he's an attractive figure. He's a heroic figure. He's different from John Smith, but he's heroic. And they're kind of fighting over her. They butt heads. But you present a Disney, because Pocahontas is essentially a Disney princess. You're presenting a Disney princess with a genuine romantic choice, where they're both good options. And I don't think I've ever seen that before.
Yeah, that's interesting. Have you ever watched While You Were Sleeping?
Yes, I think so. Back in the late 90s, probably on a plane journey.
Yeah.
Sandra Bullock?
Yes, Sandra Bullock. I feel like rom-coms are things that I'm allowed to watch on airplanes, because I don't particularly want to give myself any bad feelings on airplanes. Yeah, I don't need any more of those.
Yeah.
And because it's free and available, and because no one around me is somebody that I know who can judge me for what I'm doing. And so that's
it's a safe space.
Exactly. So that's a place where I decide that I can just watch trashy, lowbrow, basic things. And I think that is exactly what happened, is I watched it on an airplane. But I was like, I'm really in the mood for an almost Hallmark Channel level of just straight rom-com, don't have to think much about it.
Is that the one where her partner's in a coma or something? And
so here's what happens.
Oh god.
Sandra Bullock's character works for it'd be like working at the tube station, and she takes people's tickets. And there's one man who comes through every day, and because she sees him so often, she develops a crush on him and just thinks he's this amazingly handsome man. And one day, these kids run up and steal his wallet and kick him, and he falls onto the platform.
Okay.
And a train is coming, and she ends up jumping on the platform and saving him. And she wants to go to the hospital with him, and he's gotten knocked unconscious, and he's gone into a coma. And when the hospital staff are like, "Why are you here?" And she's like, "Oh, I can be here. I'm his fiance." And then all the family starts showing up, and then it gets out of control, where they all think that he's engaged to marry this woman.
That's weirdly similar. It's not 1-to-1, but that's weirdly similar to The Big Sick.
Oh yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, because it, like, the family thinking that you're in deeper than you were,
And then he ends up having a brother that she meets. The more she gets to know the brother, she starts falling in love with him. So they end up,
I see.
like, together, and it's clear that they're, like, meant to be together. But then, of course, at some point, the brother wakes up. There's a bunch of things he doesn't remember, so he just goes, "Oh, I guess I am engaged to you." But it turns out also that man is with somebody else.
Right, I see. But you don't. But I see. But you're dodging the darkness of her actually betraying him for the brother, like because she doesn't actually owe her feelings to him. She's just got into this misunderstanding essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, interesting. That's it. That's odd enough that I might revisit it, just because that's.
You know what? It is totally worth watching. I really enjoy that film.
I just briefly, I want to move on to Annie Hall in a second. I know we didn't have as long on as When Harry Met Sally, but I think this is sort of snowballing, isn't it? We're discussing a lot of sort of romantic comedy tropes, and we're building on them as we go. But just before, I want to mention one I'd watched recently that I mentioned to you was the other day I watched, because I kind of wanted to watch a sort of more generic rom-com in a sense, just to sort of talk to you about the basic tropes. But the one I ended up watching actually had its own interesting stuff going on, because it's Me Before You, the 2016 Emilia Clarke one, which I think you said you'd seen and you found fairly forgettable, fairly
bland,
generic. Yeah, very bland, but it is interestingly how it ties into some other kind of maybe derided rom-com steps, isn't it? Because I was describing it earlier today to someone as like 50 Shades of Grey, but the rich arseholes in a wheelchair. Because it's got some of that going on, hasn't it? It's got that. It's funny I mentioned Disney films before. It's got a lot of the Beauty and the Beast thing going on, hasn't it? Going to the castle and dealing with the surly, petulant aristocrat. I
can't remember how funny it actually is.
She does her best. I would say one of its problems is Emilia Clarke's not very good at rom-coms,
right.
Or at least it wasn't in 2016. In my opinion. But yeah, he's the very handsome kind of aristocratic kind of son of the manor kind of guy who doesn't treat her very well. And I was saying to you, like, one of my big problems with it is being a British person. Emilia Clarke's British and quite well to do, quite upper middle class, and sounds it. But in the film, she's bizarrely playing this working class cafe worker, like who's now become a care worker essentially, but her family showed to be really struggling, and like she's not doing that because she's a rich girl slumming it. She's making a living and a necessary living, and a lot of the plot is about that tension, that power tension of which is obviously can be quite sexy of power imbalance, but Emilia Clarke's playing it cut glass English, posh girl essentially, and it's so bizarre for an English person with any awareness of accents to hear. It's so strange.
It's strange.
It's like undercutting her role.
She plays this character that she chooses not to play.
yeah, kind of. It's almost as jarring as something like people make fun of Kevin Costner doing an American accent in Robin Hood. It's like, for me it was like that. It bothered me more than that actually, because the Prince of Thieves is such a ridiculous movie anyway. It doesn't really matter how believable that is, But anyway, I thought I'd mention it.
The film I saw, the rom-com I saw that I most recently really, really enjoyed was Isn't It Romantic, with Rebel Wilson and Liam Hemsworth.
Oh yeah,
I loved that movie.
What's the very you don't have to go
Sure.
into detail, but what's the very basic premise of that? Like...
The basic premise is that Rebel, Wilson is a more, a bigger girl and not your typical, star of a rom-com. And she hits her head one day, and suddenly everybody else thinks she's really beautiful, thinks she's like really, really hot.
Wait, she hits her head and everyone else thinks she's really hot?
She thinks she's gone crazy.
Does this involve that camera?
But you kind of get the impression that her friend at work, wants to hang out with her and maybe wants something more, but because she has such low self-esteem, she doesn't think that he's interested in her that way. But this incredibly attractive, like impossibly attractive man starts courting her. And the thing that I love about it is that I think there was another film about, what was that, like Jack Black movie?
Oh, are you talking about Shallow Hal?
Yes.
The moment you mentioned that came up. Yeah.
Shallow
Gwyneth
Hal.
Paltrow played the fat woman, basically, didn't she? Like,
yes.
With a fat suit.
And I guess there's this trope in rom-coms where you have, sort of a plain Jane kind of man who impresses himself by getting somebody who is out of his league. In fact, I think there's a rom-com called She's Out of Your League or something like that. But the fact is that they didn't show the woman who was heavier throughout the film. They have moments where you kind of see what she actually looks like, but it's like, oh, the audience couldn't possibly get past this. We need to actually have this played by a beautiful thin woman.
Yeah.
And I love it in Isn't It Romantic? You know, they don't do that. They don't like go like, oh, well, we'll put her in a, you know, this other actress in a bikini so that we can see what the man's really seeing, you know? And I think that shows some progression for women in film.
Yeah, you know what? I'll watch that. That sounds interesting. I'd like that because I'm not really a Rebel Wilson fan in general, which I think is probably quite a common opinion to express, given a lot of other movies. But
it's very funny. It's really, really, really funny.
Yeah, I'll give it a go. And
I also like, you know, that she, you know, she ends up with the best friend. I like that she doesn't end up with the like impossibly handsome man. That's not what this is about. So I think it does flip some rom-com things on its head a bit.
Oh, I'd love to watch that. I will. I'll put that on the list. So I wanted to move on, you know, albeit briefly, you know, because we've got limited time here, to Annie Hall, just as a sort of capstone on all that, the tropes and kind of features that we've discussed, because we've talked about a lot of it tangentially, but, you know, this is, of course, the 77 classic and, you know, Oscar-winning classic Woody Allen movie with co-starring Diane Keaton, and it's about the partly based on their own former, you know, when the film was made, relationship, semi-autobiographical story of their relationship and about the development of their relationship, their meeting, and then its decay, and it closes with them with the relationship being over.
Oh,
Are you okay? What's the matter? Are you all right? What?
there's a spider in the bathroom.
What?
There's a big black spider in the bathroom.
That's what you got me here for at 3 o'clock in the morning because there's a spider in the
Oh,
bathroom?
my God. I mean, you know how I'm about insects. I can't sleep with a live thing crawling around in the bathroom.
Kill it. For God, what's wrong with you? Don't you have a can of Raid in the house?
No.
I told you 1,000 times you should always keep a lot of insect spray. You never know who's going to crawl over.
I know. And a first aid kit and a
Jesus.
fire extinguisher.
All right, give me a magazine, because I'm a little tired. You know, you joke with them about me, you make fun of me, but I'm prepared for anything. An emergency, a tidal wave, an earthquake. Hey, what is this? What? Did you go to a rock concert?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, really? Really? How'd you like it? Was it, I mean, was it heavy? Did it achieve total heaviosity, or was it...
It was just great.
I got a wonderful idea. Why don't you get the guy that took you to the rock concert? We'll call him, and he can come over and kill the spider. You know,
I called you. You want to help me or not, huh?
What is this? Since when do you read the National Review? What are you turning into?
Well, I like to try to get all points of view.
Well, wonderful. Then why don't you get William F. Buckley to kill the spider?
Alvy, you're a little hostile. You know that? Not only that, you look thin and tired.
Well, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. You got me out of bed. I ran over here. I couldn't get a taxi cab. You said it was an emergency. I ran up the stairs. But I was a lot more attractive when the evening began. Are you going with a right-wing rock and roll star?
Would you like a glass of chocolate milk?
Hey, what am I, your son? What do you mean? I came over
I got the good chocolate.
Yeah,
Alvy.
where's the spider?
It's in
Is
the bathroom.
it in the bathroom?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Hey, don't squish it, and after it's dead, flush it down the toilet, okay? And flush it a couple of times.
Darling, I've been killing spiders since I was 30, okay?
I had a really... I said to you that I was going to mention this being formative to me. I watched quite a lot of Woody Allen films as a teen, and Annie Hall quite early on in that. And as someone who'd never been in a relationship, never kissed anyone, never had sex, you know, well before that, I watched Annie Hall. And for me... I actually thought about this in terms of there's the Woody Allen written and starring film Play It Again, Sam, you know, where his sort of traditionally nebbish character gets advice from Humphrey Bogart, playing, you know, sort of an actor playing Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca mode. He gets like macho advice from him. I thought that the funny thing about me trying to be an impressive, you know, romantically successful teenage boy was I was kind of doing the same, but from Woody Allen. I was sort of channeling the Woody Allen persona to try and be a successful adult, you know, a functioning adult. And I think there's probably, for people growing up when I did, and maybe a bit earlier than I did, there's probably that sense of like when you were a nerdy guy who maybe wasn't too socially confident in the late 90s, you could look to several figures, but I personally look to Woody Allen as the example of someone who, in his films at least, and I think in real life, you know, as well, has been very romantically vicarious and you know, successful, so to speak, but also is innately him. You know, he's a clever guy, he's a witty guy, he's sarcastic, he's spiky, you know, he's you can be all those things and hopefully you think as a teenage boy attract mates by doing that, you know, by peacocking in that way, but in a non-conventionally macho way. So I was very interested to revisit it, and another reason I was very interested to revisit this movie is obviously Woody Allen's recent personal controversies, accusations about his behaviour. Certainly not time to get into that now, but I for that reason I'd basically been avoiding Woody Allen films a little bit in recent years. You know, so it was super interesting to revisit this.
Yeah, it's funny because I was just thinking before you mentioned that, I was like, I wonder if we're just going to completely ignore how problematic he is and how obvious that might be to anyone listening. And just as you started to bring it up, I wasn't sure that that's what you were bringing up. I was pretty sure you were, but then your Zoom just froze and it went completely silent. And I was like,
that was me just taking a moment, yeah. No, actually, very brief sidebar. I found the Woody Allen film that stopped me watching Woody Allen films because all this stuff was breaking, you know, already a few years ago. And I rewatched Play It Again, Sam, and and Diane Keaton's in that as well before Annie Hall. And there's some dialogue in Play It Again, Sam, where she's getting drunk and he's trying to seduce her, and he wrote the script, so she's talking, and she's talking about like rape fantasies and stuff, but you know it's him writing it for her, for this sort of actress playing a drunk woman, talking about how on some level she'd like to be raped and stuff like that, and that was the bit where I was like, oh god,
that's so uncomfortable.
This is like I'm sure people had commented on how that had dated badly anyway, you know, before the Woody Allen thing.
Yeah.
But that was the reason I hadn't revisited Annie Hall, because I was kind of like, oh, do I actually really want to go back and watch this stuff? For me, leaving aside the truth of his situation and everything like that, for me, I found that I got over it very quickly watching this, and I think that was just because I fell just back into the old charm of it. You know, I felt his charm, but also, you know, Diane Keaton is not an uncharming woman in this, is she? She's a really iconic character.
And there's so many things that happened in that film that were really important for film technique, that were new and interesting and unusual, and the breaking of the fourth wall that I fell in love with. I think, you know, I can't even remember when I first saw Annie Hall, but it's one of the few movies that I own on DVD because I love it so much. But you know, what I was saying about you know, how does that first kiss happen? You know, I love that, you know, they're walking down the street and he goes, you know, how about we just like don't do that awkward thing later where we wonder if we're going to kiss. Let's just get it out of the way now. We'll just do it now, and then it won't be awkward later because it's already been done. You know, which in some ways
we can digest our food.
Yeah. Which in some ways, you know, is kind of unromantic, but because it's done in this kind of cute way, it is still very, very charming.
Yeah, and it's framed with the romantic music.
And I think I got some inspiration in my romantic life from that.
That sort of directness.
I always wanted to say it. I always wanted to do it and couldn't quite do it that way. I think one of the most recent dates that I went on that I really enjoyed, at the end of it, I didn't really get the impression that the guy was going to kiss me, and I said, "Can I goodnight kiss you?"
He was like, "What kind of kiss is that?"
And I think he said something like, "Absolutely," or like, "Hell yeah." And it was just such a cute reaction. And afterwards, I remember saying, "Well, that was extremely pleasant." And he just like, he found it really funny. And I was like, maybe I should have said something else.
Well, that's your UK side as well.
Oh yeah, for sure.
That's the British side coming out.
And he was like, "I don't think I've ever heard anyone describe a kiss that way."
Let me, because we haven't got much time. I want to get to the kind of quick of what you think about, particularly about Diane Keaton as Annie, really, because we've talked about a bit about you know, Summer and a little bit about Meg Ryan's character, Sally. You know, do you? Because I watching it this time, I was really enjoying a performance, as I always have done. And I was wondering if this, again, knowing it was written by Woody Allen, you know, and they were former lovers and everything, you know, and friends. I was thinking it still, for me, holds up as a pretty sympathetic portrayal of both sides of this relationship. Yeah. But I think there is a little bit of tiny mean-spiritedness towards the end when she is shown to have kind of blossomed, you know, on one level, but blossomed into this version of her that he doesn't really like.
Yeah.
You know,
I think,
and specifically the LA version of herself.
Yeah, which is kind of disappointing, but I think of all of the sort of female characters between the films we've talked about, she's the one that has the most character, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. She's the least sort of blank slate human being amongst all of them.
And it's partly because you get the, we talked before about the bit where you get the subtitled thoughts from both of them, but you also get things like you get insights into her therapy scenes, don't you? Yeah, at least as much as you get his,
I think that sometimes, I don't know, I think the stuff with her at the end and the sort of LA sort of stereotype she's become is almost more commentary on LA than it is on her as a human being.
Well, it's Woody Allen's, and you might say a lot of like New York writers' kind of snobbery about LA, isn't it? And kind of alienation from it, but just oppositionality of the West and East Coast.
I was just thinking what's kind of nice about this that kind of connects all these films together is that When Harry Met Sally mostly takes place in New York, and 500 Days of Summer is very much a film set in Los Angeles, and this film is set between the two.
Oh, that is a nice unifier, yeah. Yeah, and one where the dual coast setting, means quite a lot to the characters and his resentment of the outcome,
I do love that scene where he like sneezes into the Coke and it just goes everywhere.
That's hilarious.
It's so funny.
Yeah. That's an enduringly great scene, and the way it just ends on that wonderful silence where they're all still reacting to it as well. It's a very funny movie. I had a terrifying moment, the monologue that opens the film with the orange screen. And Woody's talking to the character as Alvy, and I had that terrifying thing where he's talking about, I recently turned 40, and I was like, oh, that's not too far away for me now. That's like, I mean, I'm 34, but 40 now seems a much more realistic age to be than it did when I was a teenager. Yeah,
it is one of those ages where it feels very far away until it's not so far away anymore.
Yeah, that was a bit scary, but I really enjoyed it. Again, being a bit older now, watching these things and watching these more, you might say, adult rom-coms that kind of chronicle whole relationships, and I think there is something I admire about getting past the happy ever after formula, because I think as someone who's had relationship, I'm currently in a relationship, but if as someone who has had relationships finish, and quite finally, as well as ones that have continued as friendships, you appreciate that. You appreciate being able to peruse that in art, don't you, in fiction, and it's kind of useful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's very frustrating that so much sort of classic rom-com is just focusing on the lead up to the grand infatuation and the very quick to say I love you kind of rosy outcome sort of situation, and that sort of final kiss that shows like everything's fine, we're in love now, and this is what love looks like. And I find it frustrating in a lot of ways, and it's why I loved 500 Days of Summer, and why I loved Annie Hall is because it just felt more realistic and more relatable because it was a little bit darker. But then not too long ago I decided to rewatch La La Land, which is another film that I guess genre wise it's more a musical, but it's also very much a romantic drama. And I was feeling a little woeful because of quarantine things, and I was watching it. I just realized at some point I was like, I can't watch the end of this. I can't watch them not get together. Like I just can't emotionally handle that right now.
We all have moments like that. Well, one of my favorite movies, Cabaret, is also a romantic drama where the couple don't end up together. Spoilers for Cabaret from 1972.
I'd forgotten that about Cabaret.
Oh, I love it. I'll probably end up rewatching it before lockdown's over. Well, thanks for joining me, Kat. I know you've got places to be today, but thank you so much for joining me to talk about all those movies. And I think we kind of ramblingly, it's deliberate rambling by design in a sense, but I think we managed to check off quite a few things and examine quite a few links between them there. And it's it's obviously a huge genre, so there's so many more movies we could talk about and so much more we could say about these three. But I think we did not a bad job of getting around the horn there. That was good.
Yeah, I think we did okay. Yeah.
Yeah, we did all right.
Go on. Yeah, thank you so much for having me back on. It's an absolute pleasure, as always, to speak to you. I'm excited for episode 15.
I'm too, and I'll be amazed if we get there, but we will. Thank you. Thanks so much, Kat. I really enjoyed that, and yeah, I'll just I'll see out the episode now. But yeah, that was episode 10 of the EscapeGoat podcast. Thanks, and we'll have you back on soon, Kat.
Oh, thanks again. All right, bye.
Yeah. Bye. You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Blake Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications, or get me personally on @dbfagiani. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert.